Hello and welcome. This is Chapter 2, Federal Regulation of Medications, Development, Production, and Marketing. Let's get started. These will be the objectives that we'll be working off of. These are from Chapter 2 from the book. Not all the ones that are listed in your book because we're not covering the entire chapter, but it's most of them. Now, the headings that go with the chapter go along with these. I would focus more on the headings and the subheadings that go with the headings and make an outline. Because these are pretty broad. So as you're looking into specific topics, I would use the headings. And I've already mentioned that, and I'll mention it again as well. But that they fall under these major objectives. So for the chapter is assigned. These slides supplement the text, unlike Chapter 1, which was different. So when I say a major heading, for example, in Chapter 2, a major heading is misbranding. There's going to be subheadings there under. So when I say that you're assigned the heading misbranding, the subheadings are also assigned, unless I note differently, which is going to be very few times throughout this textbook, okay? So whenever you're assigned a heading, you're also assigned the subheadings there under as well, under that major heading, unless noted. At the very end of a major heading, there's those takeaway points. Again, that gives you the main takeaways from that major heading. Very, very important because you should be able to look at those and recognize them and understand what's being said. So you get those main takeaways. That's not everything from that section. Again, it's just the main points. They're not all the details of something because it might say, for example, the manufacturer is required to put certain pieces of information on the commercial label. Well, it's not going to give you all the details in that main takeaway point, but I might expect you to know what those details are, right? So you have to have an understanding that there's requirements by the FDA on a label, and that's the takeaway point, but you might also have to know what those details are. So if you understand that, but you also have to know what the details are. So make sure that you're looking at those takeaways. If there is more details of a takeaway, you might also want to expand on those too for your study materials. But if you look at a takeaway point and you see the FDA requires that the manufacturer has to have specific information on the label, you go, "Ooh, I don't remember learning that." Then you better go back and you better make sure that you understand that. So that's the importance of takeaway points. Then there's also these study scenarios at the end of it, every major heading as well. Either I might assign some of those, we might talk about them some in class as well. So between the takeaway points and the study scenarios, oftentimes I have some of those built into the exam questions, whether they are the right or the wrong answers, or whether a little case scenario question, if you will, on an exam is built around one of those or very similar to one of those, because they don't have essays on tests for a bunch of people, but it's very similar to one of those. So you should expect to see, again, not all, but some questions that incorporate those. And at the very end of the chapter are case studies. Those are real life cases that have gone through the court system. I just really don't have time to cover them in the class. You can read them to see how they apply to real life cases, those topics. But those are optional. They're not mandated or they're not required. And again, the PowerPoint presentations have some main points, have some main topics, just have some bullet points that I'll be talking about, but they do not have all the information that you're required. So please do not think you can just look at the slides and memorize and that's it. They are supplement to the text. It's the text, it's the slides, it's the course, it's the materials, it's the discussions, it's the assignments, it's the whole thing together, okay? So if you're someone that doesn't like to come to class and pay attention and just look at the slides the night before, I would not recommend that, okay? You can do you and you can study how you want to do. That's just how I recommend to do the course because, again, this is not a straight memorization course. Looking at slides, everything is not going to be on there that you need to know, okay? So just a few additional comments, which, I've kind of said a lot of this already, but just keep in mind that not all topics in the book are covered on the slides. Everything supplements each other. You got the book, you got your slides, you got your materials, you got your takeaway points, you got your case scenarios, right? So again, just don't look at the slide and think that's all that's on there. There will be additional practice activities and resources for some content throughout the course, so make sure you look at Canvas too. Again, how do I recommend you studying? Preparing an outline, right? Whether you start with your slides and you build on that, whether you start with the topic headings and you go that way, however you need to put this all together, but you want to be able to understand the information and apply it, and that takes everything put together. If there's any updates since the textbook, because things do update, I'll make sure I provide that in class. Might be on the slides, but it might also just be mentioned in class, so make sure you listen and note if that's the case, because things, not everything here obviously updates quickly, but sometimes things will update and then I'll have stuff already posted and then there might be an update on something. So again, it's not always going to be on the slide. It could be in class as well too. So pretty much the main headings from chapter 2, a lot of them are covered. That would be all the subheadings they're under. However, there are a few headings, major headings that I'm not going to require. And there's one major heading that I'm not going to require some of it under. So that's not meant to confuse you. Again, it's just trying to limit the content for you. So you can see the testable main topics here, the Food and Drug Administration, defining and distinguishing the drugs. Although in there I put information about how to approach it, we're just going to look at from a higher level. Prohibited acts, that's going to be, those are going to be required, adulteration, misbranding, subheadings under new drug approval. So new drug approval, the whole section will not be required, but just certain ones. These are the subheadings under there. Marketed unapproved drugs, biologics, MedWatch, medical devices, and cosmetics. So those will be the testable main topics and some of the subheadings from chapter 2, because like I said, new drug approval is a major heading, but I'm not going to require all that. But otherwise, whatever headings are listed here and the subheadings they're under will be testable. So again, pay attention as we go throughout, because I'll have on slides things that are covered and aren't covered on the exam. All right, so let's move on. All right, so let's get started. So chapter 2 and chapter 3 are going to focus on the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, and this is a major federal law. And basically, chapter 2 is focusing on more of the manufacturing side of things. So you may say, well, I'm not going to be manufacturing and distributing, and I understand that for practicing pharmacy, that's probably not something you're going to be doing a lot of. However, we are dealing with products that are manufactured and distributing, and sometimes practice pharmacy does cross over those lines. It involves that, and ultimately we are handling that product, and we do have to have some understanding of that, and sometimes we do have to follow the same rules and sections of that as well too. So although section 3 is going to be more important, which deals with how it impacts the practice of pharmacy, the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, we do need to understand some of these sections as well too. So we're not as involved with chapter 2 as well as these topics, but this is what my expectations are for you in chapter 2. So the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act is, again, major federal law. It is something that impacts us every day in the practice of pharmacy. You hear about it. Most, or I should say, every state law also has pretty much some type of law that has the same aspects of it as well too. So when we hear the terms misbranding and adulteration, which are two of the major things that are covered under the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, the major things that you can do against it, if you will, penalties. State laws have those things in them as well too. So whenever we look at your state laws as well, we'll also see under there adulteration and misbranding. Okay, so the intent of this law was to protect consumers basically from adulterated and misbranded laws. Adulterated and misbranded products. So Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. So it has foods, drugs, cosmetics, but it also covers devices. Okay, when we say drugs, it's over the counter, it's prescription. All right, so it's just not like we're thinking prescription probably because we're pharmacy, right? But it also has over the counter, but it also does compounding. We also have tobacco, covers tobacco. Okay. When I say devices, I'm talking about medical devices. So it doesn't just do that. It's dietary supplements, it's vitamins. So it regulates a lot more, okay, than just drugs, which is kind of what we're probably thinking about. So food, drugs, cosmetics, additional things as well too. So remember that it regulates a lot more than just drugs. Again, this is oriented probably more towards manufacturers, but it also impacts us in the pharmacy practice world, more so recently in the last decade or so, especially with compounding and stuff, but and with track and trace, which is basically trying to protect the integrity of the drug supply chain. So the historical overview. This law came into play in 1938 because we had a law in 1906 called the Pure Food and Drug Act that did not really do its job. So unfortunately, a lot of times the laws that we have into place these days come into play because of a tragedy. And there was a tragedy back in 1937, which was a sulfa elixir tragedy that ended in the death of dozens of individuals. It wasn't the sulfa itself; it was it was mixed with a chemical to make a liquid with it that unfortunately, wasn't protected to be made that way, and it was basically poisoned people. So ended with this law. So we are still under the 1938 with amendments. There's lots of amendments to get to today, right? Which is fast forward, coming up on not almost 90, plus years, later. So in what 20 plus years, 2024 today is when I'm recording it. So here we are, and we have all these amendments. So do you need to memorize the language of every amendment, the year? No. But we are going to be talking about certain main amendments, okay, and their impacts. Now, the book goes into some of the major ones. I want you to read through, and I want you to see kind of like how we've progressed over the time and read through and see things. And then obviously we're going to be focusing on some main ones. So you should have an understanding when I say Durham-Humphrey, which basically chapter 3 is focused all on that, because that's had major impacts on pharmacy practice. When I say Kefauver-Harris, okay, when I say Drug Quality Security Act, that has major implications on pharmacy practice. We're going to be focusing on a handful of those, okay? So the ones that we spend time focusing on, you should understand what those ones are called, all right? But the ones that are just listed on those first few pages and we spend no time on, you heard them. So maybe if someone says them, you're like, oh yeah, I remember hearing that. But you're not going to know, the fine details of them because we're not going to be talking about them. And this, time in class is not making you an expert on these, right? We're just, there's a few pages in a book about them. So for us talking about compounding in this course, I can tell you is just really an introduction to it, because everything going on in the world today in compounding, you could probably have a 3-credit course on it, and you could probably go out and do a whole bunch more on it. So anyone interested in compounding, you're going to need to go out and do a whole bunch more on it to know more about it. And if you're going to own a compounding pharmacy and do more, you're going to have to do way, way more than what's in this course. So there's a lot more above and beyond this course here. I'm just giving you kind of like an intro to it and a basic understanding, just so you know. But you should have an understanding of the names of the amendments that we're spending a little bit more time on. You don't need to memorize the exact years, okay? So if I ask a question on it, like I might say the Drug Quality Security Act of 2013, the DQSA, right? I might ask a question like that. But all those ones listed at the beginning of the chapter, no. But when I start going into the few that we spend more time on, yes, I will expect you to know the Durham-Humphrey Amendment of 1951 and some basics about it, which when we get into chapter 3, you'll see that the whole chapter is pretty much on that. So given that the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act is a federal law, okay, it has a federal administrative agency that's vested primary enforcement, and that's the Food Drug Administration. Now that this is all under the Department of Health and Human Services, which again is the federal side of things. Now, again, if your state has a drug law, food drug law, whatever they term it, that's going to be the state side of things too. Might be very, very similar to this. We're not looking at that today, just so you know. So if you hear about the state doing something with enforcement of misbranding, adulteration, or whatever, that's under the state. This is under the federal one. This is going to be through the FDA. So the FDA has www.fda.gov. You've probably had a course learning about drug information, right? Looking at the drug and looking at like the package insert, studies that have involved the FDA and things that they've done. The FDA has a really, really good website, lots of resources. You can actually find the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act there. You can find the guidance documents that the FDA puts out, which are not law, not regulations, which you can find the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, and you can find the regulations that are put out, which are the Code of Federal Regulations. So you can find your legal materials there too. But when the FDA wants to give you information, which is their thinking on something, guidance documents, which I like to say you want to make sure you're probably following that as well too, because that's like a practice standard, right? That's what the FDA thinks. Even though they say it's not enforceable as law, you want to say, well, this is what the FDA is telling us that they think on something. It's probably pretty important. So those are important too. So even though it doesn't go through the regulatory process, you want to look at a guidance document as it's like, okay, this is important. So the FDA puts those on their website as well too. So guidance documents have been very important, especially when it comes to the compounding, because they've probably put dozens of guidance documents out. Now, they do give the public chances to comment on them, if you will, and they might have some public comment periods and meetings out there and stuff like that, but it doesn't go through the true regulatory process out there. But there's tons of guidance documents out there on the FDA website for different types of different types of topics as well. So lots of resources available on the FDA website. Very good website. You can go on and get your name on listservs for all different types of stuff as well too. So you want to be familiar with the FDA website. The structure of the FDA, they have various types of offices and centers. Like I said, they regulate a number of things. They regulate tobacco, they regulate medical devices, they regulate vet meds, they regulate, all different things. So you can look at their organizational chart. Changes occasionally. So in fact, it just changed a couple years. They rearrange things occasionally as well. So if you want to look at the most current one, it's on their website. But they have CDER, CDER, so that's for drugs and how they evaluate that in the research. And then they have CBER, which is for the biologicals. So, those are probably the two biggest ones in terms of for drugs and stuff like that. So if you want to look and see how they're organized, just to have an idea of how that impacts us, you might want to look at that. So when you look at laws and rules and usually like the guidance documents as well too, but especially the laws and the rules, they're going to put definitions in there. And definitions are important because when you say words or we say things in terms of you're doing something, there's a meaning there. So if you say, oh, you misbranded that product, well, there's an actual meaning to what misbranding is. Or if you say, oh, that product's adulterated, there's a definition for what adulteration is. And if I say, oh, you're practicing pharmacy, there's actually a meaning to what that practicing of pharmacy is. There's a definition to that. So we're going to start with looking at some definitions that are important under the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. So here's a definition of drug, here's a definition of device, and here's a definition of cosmetic. And the reason why this is important is because the FDA regulates them differently. So the FDA for a drug, to get on the market and to be sold, okay, as a drug, the FDA has to prove it as a drug. The FDA just doesn't let someone say, hey, here's a drug, I'm going to sell it. All right. And now we're not going to take time and we're not going to go through and we're not going to study and we're not going to look at the new drug approval process, which is something that I'm going to let you not be tested on in this chapter, which is the new drug approval process. Not because it could be tested on the MPJE, I believe. It's linked to something, a very small portion, but because I believe you guys already learned it. So that's going to be something that I'm going to exclude. So again, you don't have to read it. I'm not going to test on it, but that's because I believe you guys have already learned about it in a class. So the process, though, is that, the manufacturer, if you will, has to submit information. They have to go through an NDA, right? So that's a lengthy process. They have to show it. It's a very costly process. They have to show their studies and stuff like that. Once it's proven, that it's met whatever the FDA standards are, right? Basically, its benefits outweigh its risk. It proves that it meets whatever the conditions are for whatever it's trying to prove that it's effective for. It's safe and effective. The FDA will allow it to be on the market, right, for that condition that it's approved for. So if someone just puts something out there and says this is for arthritis and it hasn't been proven safe and effective, then they just put in a drug on the market and it hasn't gone through the proper channels. That's a problem. So it has to be proven appropriately. So this comes into play when we have foods or we have dietary supplements. If they make claims that say this can help your arthritis or this can help your heart disease, and it has not been approved by the FDA, and it's considered by the FDA as a drug, then that's a problem. So that's why it's important to understand what the definitions are. Now, a device acts in our body not like a drug does through the chemical effect. It acts differently. And then a cosmetic, we're not going to spend a lot of time on a cosmetic, but you can see that it's defined differently. And cosmetics don't have to be pre-approved like drugs do. But the definition of drug, you can see, is articles that basically are intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. Okay, and are intended to affect the structure or any function of the body. So that's the definition. If something's out there, basically, that's intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent disease, okay, intended to affect the structure or function of the body. Again, it's up to the FDA to determine that. So we're looking at that. So if someone wants to put food on the market and say, eat this, you're going to get your vitamins from it, that's a food. Okay, or you're going to get, your nutrients from it, you're going to get your daily intake of things. It's a food. Okay, that's much different than saying, eat this, and that's going to cure your diabetes. Now you're intending to treat or prevent something. Okay, a lot different. So for drug, so this gets a little confusing because, and as you look at the book here, you'll see that the book gives some examples and things like that. And you might notice just from the little bit of information in the book that there's been some confusion over the years, even in the courts, and there's been some confusing cases. So I guess what does the manufacturer intend it to be? What does the supplier intend it to be? What does the consumer believe it to be, right? You have to think about those things as well. But just because the supplier says this isn't a drug, right? That doesn't mean it's not a drug, right? The purchaser, what do they think it is, right? All those things have to be considered. Is there scientific evidence, right? Has the claim that's being made, has it been approved by the FDA, right? There's a lot of things that go into it. So I think you can see, though, that it's confusing. So I think for this course, I think after it's all said and done, I think there's a couple statements we can make, but I think it's important that we can focus on the definitions and the claims, okay? But would the claim fit under the definition of a drug? Okay, so what's the definition of a drug? I just showed you. And would the claim fit under that definition? So if the food or if the dietary supplement, if they're making a claim, where would that fit, right? It seems to assist in the aid of sleeping. Does that seem to cure a disease? No, it aids in sleeping. So that doesn't probably like tell someone it helps with disease. It's just going to help you go to sleep. But if it says, it treats insomnia or something, that's a little bit different, right? So you have to look how they make their claims, if you will. And the book gives some examples of that. Okay, so I think we need to look at how those things are being said, because you can see this is a gray area. Okay, it's hard to test on these types of things. If the courts have a hard time with it, it's going to be really hard to test the question on there. So if I were to even have a question on this topic, which if I would, it would probably just be like one or two. That's one thing I would probably test on is a claim. And it would have to be enough information to either be like, is this a drug or not? Okay, if it wouldn't be, it would be either a food or dietary supplement, and it would fit under a category of either not or being a drug. So as I mentioned, the FDA also oversees or regulates more than just drugs, one of them being tobacco and related products. We'll talk about that in a minute here. But this has been since 2009, the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Act, which amended the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, also grants the FDA authority to regulate the tobacco and the related products. So this is the contents of tobacco. They require disclosure of product contents, prohibits certain additives, requires more effective warnings, strictly controls or prohibits the marketing and sales campaigns and those directed at children. So again, it's just not the actual tobacco itself. It's a lot more that surrounds that. So in 2016, it also expanded to products that requires that retailers may not sell covered products to those under 18. So an age restriction, if you will, went on there. And they must verify that age with photograph identification, unless the person is over the age of 26. So kind of have to start looking at people, I guess, and seeing, how old they are or what they look like. Companies must also warn the consumer that nicotine is addictive and must submit new and existing products for FDA approval. And the FDA has been working on that for years. They got a ton of products, if you will. Now, since then, there's also been a lot in the last few years about e-cigarettes, vapes, other type of nicotine delivery systems. So ENDS, I guess, is what it's called. And then there's also been what we call non-tobacco nicotine, NTN, or synthetic nicotine. So those have all been found to also be under this as well, too, because, as new things come out. So all that falls under this, and the FDA does oversee these. Alrighty, so specifically, the book kind of breaks it down into sections, but again, we can look at it kind of from an overall broad perspective too as well. But for food, we think about food when we eat it normally as expected, right, versus a drug. Food claims can be considered a drug if they cross a line, if you will, because we're eating food really just to supplement our nutrition, if you will. So food claims could run afoul, really, depending on if certain things are being said. So food making, health, or disease prevention claims are usually not permitted. Now, some might have scientific evidence, but they must meet cautions of how they're done. So again, the book does give some examples. For example, some cereals in the past have made some claims about psyllium with cholesterol lowering, helping like some heart disease. But even so, then they can exceed what they're allowed to say or how they do it. The manufacturers might push that even to the limits. So you have to watch how that's being done. But foods, again, can cross the line, and they might be considered a drug if how they make a claim or the claims that they're making. So you have to watch out for that. The FDA has established two special categories of foods. So you have just food in general, but then there's some foods. So there's something called a special dietary food, and there's something called a medical food as well. So you want to be aware of those, because occasionally you might be asked, depending on where you work, especially in the community setting, you might be asked to order or be involved in something like that. Then you get into the dietary supplements versus drugs. And this is something that if you especially work in the community pharmacy, or if you're involved in this type of area, because some people, especially like certain types of pharmacies, may focus on the dietary supplements. And a lot of times we think about this more in the clinical aspect to make sure that we understand that patients, if they're taking drugs, medications, and dietary supplements, in terms of making sure that they don't have interactions. But we also want to make sure that patients, if they're seeing certain types of claims or whatever, that if they're taking a dietary supplement, that maybe they're not thinking it's treating something, and they're not foregoing seeing a doctor or healthcare provider because it's treating something, and maybe it's not because of a certain health claim. So understanding that as well. But dietary supplements are treated more like a food versus a drug in terms of the regulation. And what I mean by that is, we know that drugs have to go through this lengthy approval process. They have to prove what they're saying, right? They have to prove with studies, go through this NDA, and they got to prove. So if they say that they treat blood pressure, right, they got to show by studies that they treat blood pressure. They have to prove that they're safe and effective. They got, this NDA, this pre-market approval and everything. Dietary supplements don't have to do that. So DSHEA, which is this one amendment, this created this category of dietary supplements. Again, they're treated more like a food than a drug. They don't have this pre-market approval. Now, FDA could take it off the market if it's adulterated, if it's unsafe or something like that. So it's not like, anyone could just throw it on the market and it be unsafe and stuff like that. But it's not treated like a drug in that sense. In fact, the definition is it's intended to supplement the diet. It contains one or more of the following: a vitamin, mineral, herb, amino acid. So it's not defined like a drug. But it also does allow 4 types of nutritional claims, okay? Statements, if you will. So it can state that it will benefit a classic nutrient deficiency disease as long as it discloses the prevalence of it in the United States. It can also describe the role of affecting the structure or function of the body with that disease state. Statements that characterize the documented mechanism by which the disease state acts to maintain the structure of a function. Statements that describe general well-being from consumption of that product, such as may assist in relaxing someone or something, and that's what the book is examples. So the book is examples of these statements. So DSHEA does allow certain kind of statements on products, but they can't cross the line over to what a drug would be. And the FDA gets to make the decision, okay? So again, companies can push what that line is. Again, the FDA has given guidance over the years. We've seen various types of case law on it. So this, again, could be a gray area and confusing. So that's where we get into a statement. Does it look like what a drug would say? Does it look like what a drug would not say? If I give a test question on it, it would probably be pretty clear. But I could also ask a test question just on, like, what can a dietary supplement do, or what is a dietary supplement, right? So just understanding that we have a drug, we have a dietary supplement, right? We have a food, understanding that there's definitions with them as well too. So if I were to ask a question, I would say you probably want to understand that there's different categories, there's definitions, that there's certain things allowed, that if there's a claim, what would distinguish the claim, right, in terms of the differences, which would really be the definition. Maybe if I would give an example, it would have to probably be a pretty clear example. So I'm looking for a bird's eye perspective here. I'm not looking for you when you look at the book there, that's fine that you read it and you see that, this is pretty complicated. I only give you a few pages on it. It's not like I'm asking you to read a whole book on it or whatever, but you can see it's pretty complicated. There's qualified claims, there's unqualified claims, there's allowances for these types of claims, there's all these things. At the end of the day, though, this is a complicated thing. If regular people can't understand it, if patients can't understand it, how can we help them, right? If a patient comes up and if they see something on a bottle of a dietary supplement, what does that mean to them? They might come up and say, look at this bottle here, this of this dietary supplement, how can you help them understand what that means to them? Okay. If it says, this may help me relax, or this may help aid in weight loss, or something like that, is that an okay statement? Is that going to work? Right? That compared to a drug. So again, it's confusing. Courts have struggled with this. There's various regulations, amendments have been passed. Some takeaway points for you. You may be dealing with certain types of nutritional dietary supplements. You want to know the differences. Think about the average patient. If this is confusing for us, it's definitely confusing for them. And again, for exam purposes, think about the types of questions I can ask. Drug versus food, drug versus dietary supplement. I'm looking for higher level concepts here, not the fine details like I mentioned. Now, next thing we're going to get into are, again, the prohibited acts, penalties, and enforcement. So we're prohibited from dealing with misbranded and adulterated products. These are two major offenses of the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, and you will see questions on the exam about this, okay? These violations are what we call strict liability nature, okay? So typically, when you get charged with something, you have to have some kind of intent or knowledge that you did something. Here, it doesn't really matter if you did it. You can be charged with it. Now, not saying that if you had no knowledge and you help the FDA or whoever, if that's what comes in and it's at the federal level, they may give you a good faith exception. It's up to them if they want to charge you, and we'll look at some examples of that later. But again, this is a strict liability. So the type of law it is, the FDA could come and they could fine or charge or press penalties, if you will, against anyone or any entity, if you will, like a company, because there's damages. They can fine or they can put the penalties against a company or the individuals, I guess, involved. So again, the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act allows the FDA to enforce it. There are different ways that they can enforce this law. So they can do what's called an injunctive action. So they can go in and say you have to stop the illegal activity. So if there's a manufacturing plant and there's a problem with the product, they can cease that product being basically made. Stop, you can't make it anymore. There's a problem with the product, stop it. You can't distribute it anymore, it's done. There's criminal proceedings. There's penalties that way. It could be fines, imprisonment. They could seize the adulterated or misbranded products in interstate commerce. They could send out warning letters basically and say, hey, look, it's come to our attention that you're doing this. This is wrong. You need to stop now. If not, we can take further action. So it's kind of like a cease and desist letter. They could also go after the corporate officers when other employees violate the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. So there's a variety of ways that they can deal with things. Depending on the situation and the potential harm or the harm that's already occurred, I guess. So recalls are another way to deal with medications or drugs or products that are already out on the market, and depending on what the public health risk and the level of that public health risk. Now, FDA actually does not have the right to do recalls with all products out there that they regulate. They're limited in scope of that. So they do have recall authority for certain things like medical devices and biologicals. But the manufacturer will do a voluntary recall on things if there's obviously an issue. The FDA can request the manufacturer to do it, but they're not authorized to actually do it themselves on a lot of things. So that gets a little bit, a lot of people are like, really? That doesn't sound right. But I guess there's not a legal authority to do it, but I guess a company, if there's a problem with their product and the FDA is like, okay, what's the recall going to be? They're probably not going to go against the FDA, right, suggesting it or asking for it. In fact, they work with the FDA to come up with probably what the best recall is, and the recalls are put on the FDA website and everything. So you're going to see a manufacturer do recall if there's something wrong with the product, okay? But the actual legal authority, I guess, probably doesn't come from the FDA in a lot of these instances. But the FDA does have legal authority under some products, if you will, like the medical devices and the biologicals. So if the manufacturer would not respond to a request, let's just say hypothetically, that's where the FDA could seize the product or take injunctive action, like I said, through the courts on the prior slide. Now, the FDA can prescribe the procedures for the recall. So if the manufacturer's like, okay, we have to do a recall, right? The FDA can say, okay, this is the best way to do this. So the manufacturer is to notify the seller of the recall. The seller is to contact the consumers if that's what is decided of the best recall. Not all recalls are going to go down to the patients that already got it, because if it's determined that, that risk type analysis is not needed, then that's not going to be done. So it depends. But if it reaches that level, that's how it's most likely going to happen, probably. Pharmacists are responsible for keeping up to date on the recalls. Dispensing a recalled product violates the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, and one could face enforcement or civil action if a patient is injured. So that's very important, because even though you might not be involved with manufacturing the product, it's on your shelves, okay? And once a recall has been put out, you can sit there and say, oh, I wasn't aware of that recall. You need to keep up to date on those. Now, manufacturers are going to be telling you, so whether you keep abreast of it through whatever your lines of communication are, you need to be checking on them or whatever. Again, get on those listservs, make sure your faxes or whatever way you get those communications are, make sure you're keeping up to date on those, because once a recall is put out, you do not want to be dispensing or giving out. Plus, once a recall is out, if it's your obligation to contact the patients that received it as well too, you want to get on that as soon as possible. So the 3 types of recalls are listed here: Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. Class 3 you can see is not likely to cause adverse health consequences, where Class 1 is there is a reasonable probability. So that is the most severe. There are Q&As on the FDA's website about recalls. Any more, a little bit more background on it, you can go read those. So adulteration and misbranding have definitions. They're pretty lengthy, but I would encourage you to go to the book. In fact, it's required because it's assigned reading. Read through that, look at it, because there's multiple things listed under there. Now, I'm going to have a mini topics lecture, which is kind of like a honed in focus little thing for you that you can give you some more visuals and some more information about that. But, you want to see that there's multiple things here that can lead to adulteration, all right? And some of these happen in the pharmacy on a daily basis, all right? This is a testable topic on the MPJE. This is something we can deal with every day in the practice of pharmacy. It doesn't just happen at the manufacturing facilities, okay? It's something that we deal with in pharmacy every day, so we want to be aware of it. It's something we can be charged with. It's something that also happens at the state level, and state laws. We'll probably also see it in the Board of Pharmacy rules and regulations at any state level as well too. So we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of it, and that it can come through multiple different ways. So look at the definition, understand it's just not dirty drugs. It's not, something that's filthy, right? It comes in multiple different ways. There's multiple reasons under the definition there. Okay, so make sure you pay attention to that. And it's not even that it is filthy or putrid or dirty, so it's the fact that it may be. Okay, it may have been prepared, it may be contaminated, it may have been stored improperly and not at the integrity that it should be or something. All right, so I'll give you an example. Back when I used to practice all the time, there was a medication that was new to the market, and we got it in from the distributor, and they came in and it was in like a refrigerated tote, and we signed for it, and we should have put it right in the refrigerator. Well, the technician, I guess, wasn't paying attention, and they put it on the shelf instead of the refrigerator. So they put it on the shelf under whatever the drug name was. Let's say it started with L. So they put it in the section with L. So like the next day, someone's walking around, they see the drug, they're like, oh, that doesn't go there. That's supposed to go in the fridge. So we call the manufacturer. We're like, yeah, we didn't put it in the fridge. We put it on the shelf. And the manufacturer's like, well, it can only stay at room temperature for 8 hours. You've had it on the shelf for this long. We can't guarantee that it's stable still. Was it adulterated? We don't know. Could it have been? Yes, right? So at that point, we're like, we can't sell it. Had it been within the 8 hours, the manufacturer said that still would have been stable, fine, but guess what? It wasn't. So we took the hit on it, we returned it, we took the loss, right? Was it? We don't know. There wasn't studies to say for sure. So we just don't know. But we assumed it was adulterated at that point. So it was held improperly, as you can see here. Drug was held improperly. It may have been held improperly. So we just assumed it was. So anyways, so we're going to look at misbranding too as well. A drug could be found adulterated and misbranded at the same time. Keep that in mind. But sometimes you'll see the FDA will just charge adulteration. They might just charge misbranding. They might charge both at the same time. Again, it's really up to the agency to decide how they want to proceed, I guess, but depending on what they do. One of the things under adulteration is that drugs must be manufactured in accordance with current good manufacturing practices. That's a whole nother set of regulations that the FDA requires of manufacturers, distributors. So if you're in any type of manufacturing type business or activity, you're going to have to worry about those too. We don't get into that in this type of class. That's beyond the scope of this class. However, if you are dealing with 503B pharmacies, which we'll get into in chapter 3 a little bit, you do have to worry about CGMPs as well too. So you might have to deal with CGMPs within the practice of pharmacy as well, or at least dealing with outsourcing facilities. So that might be a term that you might have to understand more so. But that's an important thing to think about as well too. But we're not going to get into the details of what CGMPs are, but just understand that CGMPs must be met to not be adulterated if that's a requirement of your facility. The FDA does inspect manufacturers every 2 years. But in general, pharmacies are not going to have to meet CGMPs unless you're a 503B. But you're not going to have to meet them in general. And the FDA is not going to be coming in and inspecting pharmacies normally as well too. Although the FDA does have the right to come and inspect because you're dealing with drugs and stuff. But for the most part, they're not going to be coming into your traditional type pharmacies. So misbranding, again, you want to look at the book, you want to read that. Again, there's going to be a mini topic that talks about it as well too. We'll get to that a little bit later. Again, it's just not a label that's incorrect. Other things fall in there too, such as imitation drugs, such as the labeling where the product can be used safely. It has to be used safely by the person for intended purposes. There's other things here too. You don't give the proper information that you're required to with the labeling of the product. Not the patient information, sorry. So there's other things that fall under misbranding as well too. So make sure you look at that and understand that there's other things there too. So here are some examples of misbranding. I'm sorry, not misbranding, of labeling, sorry, of products. So on the very right there, you can see is a dietary supplement. Okay, so you can look at it and see that's a melatonin. It says natural sleep formulation. Okay, so that is really not regulated in terms of the sense as a drug where it has to be approved in advance. You can see at the very bottom it says this statement has not been evaluated by the FDA. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. That's the definition of a drug, right? So when you read in the differences between supplement versus drug or whatever, that's one of the requirements of a supplement is it's distinguishing itself from a drug. Now, from that label you can't see, but it doesn't have any claims on it directly there, so hopefully nowhere on the label it says treats insomnia, anything like that, because that would be a problem. But so that's an example of one there. Atorvastatin is to the left there. That's an example of a prescription drug. Above there are some OTC products. So these are some label examples, if you will. So non-prescription drug labeling. So these are all regulated by the FDA. Okay. OTC drugs must contain specific information. The book has the complete list. Again, I'm not going to sit here and retype everything for you. It's all there. But the list contains adequate directions for use. You must have the drug facts panel, which on that last picture there, the OTC, I've showed you a picture. I have another one here too. If you repackage drugs in your pharmacy, OTC, you must comply with the manufacturing labeling requirements. Okay, so you probably don't want to do that. I wouldn't get into the habit of or not habit. I just wouldn't do it because you must meet the requirements that the manufacturer must do. So just don't do it. Otherwise, you got to do all that stuff. So what makes a drug an OTC? The manufacturer can request at the beginning. There can be a process to switch from prescription to OTC later on. There's various ways to do that. The book talks about those various ways. Drugs to be OTC can be used by a lay person without the oversight of a prescriber or physician. So, it has to prove that can be done. But the labeling has to be able to meet requirements for that lay person, okay? And certain information has to be on there. So I do kind of clump it all together on there. The book has a nice longer list, if you will, that separates it out a little bit. Probably want to look at that a little bit better in terms of spacing it out. Okay, so here's the drug facts panel. Here's the picture of the drug facts panel example from the FDA website. That's just part of the label requirement. Okay, that's not everything, that's just part of it. This is all standardized. Every company has to meet this. So every drug facts panel is going to look like this. I mean, there might be some little variances in terms because every drug's a little bit different, but it has to meet this standardized format. You will also see drugs that are could be labeled for both prescription and over-the-counter. Because there will be indications for ones that can be used safely and effectively when they are sold without a prescription, and ones that will be required to be sold with a prescription. And those are with the oversight of a prescriber, so those would have to be by a pharmacy or pharmacist. So if you would take two examples, you could look up, like for example, OTC Prilosec, look at the labeling for that, look at the labeling for RX Prilosec. You'll see, one's probably for like short-term GERD, how to use that, and then the other one would be probably like for indications, might be like more for like ulcers for that. So you can look up a couple of those if you want to see, but those would be drugs that would have both. And I gave some other examples there as well. So two other definitions would be a label and labeling. So the label will be that sticker that's attached to like the manufacturer container, and the labeling is that label plus the accompanying information, such as that package insert that comes with it. So for the prescription drug commercial container, that has to have that sticker, if you will, or that label that's on there, that has to have specific information. This is, and you'll see a lot of the same information that has to be on what I put for or what's in the book, or what's on the slide over there for the non-prescription label. A lot of the same information, but remember, this has to be sold by prescription, so it's not available to the consumer. So this is going to be available pretty much to the pharmacy, at least in our world. But you'll see on here that the symbol RX only is on there. So I showed you a slide a little bit ago that had atorvastatin. If you look real close at that, you'll see there's an RX only on there. So when you pick up a prescription one, you'll be able to tell that requires a prescription. So if you sell or give or would sell something like that to a patient without a prescription, you've actually misbranded that. So make sure you have a prescription before you sell it. But that's one way to tell if something requires a prescription or not, is by the label. Now, unit doses, which can be made by the manufacturer, which are very convenient in certain types of settings, must also have certain pieces of information. However, those lists I just showed you on the last slide, it's hard to put all that information on there. So the FDA has given like a condensed list of information that can go on a unit dose. So this is the list that they give. So for that package insert that I said, this is what we call the labeling. Most commonly for us, that's what we are used to. This is also approved by the FDA, has to meet certain requirements. It's also standardized. So when you open them up, they pretty much look the same. Obviously, the content's going to be different because the medications are different. But you'll see a highlight section if there's any black box warnings, because not all drugs have them. There's going to be the pregnancy warnings. There's going to be, it's going to flow a certain way. Now, for pregnancy warnings, I want to mention to you that I'm sorry, it falls within there. The reason why I put on here for the pregnancy warnings is because there was a rule within the last, well, it happened in 2015. So within the last decade, that it used to be A, B, C, D, or X. They defined those categories, but now drugs that have been approved since then, and then they requested drugs before then to basically go with these headings, whether the drug in pregnancy, lactation, females and males of reproductive potential, and then there's information there under. So they kind of said we're no longer doing the A, B, C, D, X, but you could see both because the drugs since 2015, obviously there's drugs before 2015, so they weren't required to, but the FDA is asking, so you might see some of both. So that's why I wanted to point it out there. The package insert, again, is approved by the FDA. It is part of the official labeling. You can give it to the patient. You're not required to. It is written towards the healthcare providers, so it's something that you understand, but most likely the layperson doesn't if they ask for it. But you may want to have a discussion with the patient of why they want it or how to understand it or what they're looking for. Obviously, people can get it off the internet. It's free. A lot of times when you go onto the manufacturer's website, they ask if you're a consumer or if you're a healthcare provider so they can direct them in the correct way. So, they're just not doing it, but obviously it's accessible anyways, but just so you know. NDC codes, so national drug codes. So currently they are 10 digits. There's different ways that they can be put together, but there's 3 segments. It could be 442, 532, or 541 segments. We do make them into 11 digits for billing, so we pad them with a 0 somewhere. If you want to see how the zeros are padded, you can find them on the internet, but that's more because of HIPAA reasons for electronic billing. It used to be 9 digits, but they're now 10, like I said. They are going to be 12 here eventually. The FDA proposed a rule to make them 12 because they're running out of 10-digit numbers, excuse me. They are put on over-the-counter and prescription drugs. FDA assigns them. They're used for a variety of purposes. Probably most notably is for identification and for billing purposes, safety reasons when we're checking and scanning them as well too. So if you want further information on them in terms of there's a data bank out there as well too. But important thing, just because a drug has an FDA assigned NDC number does not mean it's approved drug in terms of an NDA. It hasn't gone through the approval process. You may think that, but that's not always the case. There are some non-approved drugs out there for a variety of reasons. So don't think that. The way to find out if a drug has been approved by the FDA is actually through there's an approved list out there, but there's the orange book and then there's the purple book as well too. But the FDA assigns these products NDC, but it doesn't automatically mean that they're approved by the FDA as safe and effective. So again, this is a main heading that I'm not going to test you on. However, this is an instance where there are a few subheadings, just a couple pages in the book that I do want you to read a couple of the subheadings. there. So in general, the new drug approval process you've learned, you've gone through, but there's a couple things that I do want you to look at called post-marketing surveillance, REMS, risk evaluation, mitigation strategy, post-market labeling, emergency use authorization, drug efficacy study implementation, over-the-counter drug review. And again, there's some of these are just like a paragraph, okay? And I also want you to realize for new drugs to be introduced into the interstate commerce, they have to be approved by the FDA, and that the definition of a new drug isn't just like this brand new compound that you found. You know, there's someone out there and they find a new plant or something like that, or they discover a new chemical through like a chemical analysis or something like that. That it's actually, it could be like an existing one or something like that, or a change to an existing one or something as well too. But it's actually, they have to be approved by the FDA. So a new drug could include one that is, it's not generally safe for one that's already out there, I guess, is what I'm saying. So an approved drug can become a new drug from changes in the product or the labeling, all right, is what I'm trying to say. So make sure those few subheadings that I list here, again, a lot of them are just paragraphs. I want you to make sure that you look at those subheadings as well. And here are some basic bullet points about them. So post-marketing surveillance. So why I'm saying this is because this is after it gets out on the market. It's important to do this as well too, because oftentimes during the NDA or while drugs are being approved, you don't identify concerns, but after it gets out on the market. And this is where REMS can be assigned during the approval process, but oftentimes, sometimes, we have REMS that pop up after post-market. REMS are important because pharmacy, and again, it can occur before, but also after, but pharmacies, pharmacists do have a large role to play in REMS in many of the drugs out there. It could be as simple as a medication guide. It could also be patient information we have to input, we have to gather. So there are a lot of medications out there that have REMS, and pharmacies are involved with a good number of them. So, and if you've worked in the pharmacy or you've been on rotations, you've probably been exposed to some of those. Okay, the chart of the REMS are on the FDA website. I'm not going to test you on those drugs and those REMS. Those could be open for MPJE, just like the medication guides and the patient information that we'll see in Chapter 3. I'm not going to get into all those things for this course. That's information I'm leaving out for you that I'm not going to test you on, but they could be open for the state law exams as well. So I want to make sure that you understand those. FDA can also change the labeling after things are on the market, because sometimes, again, we learn of risks or we learn of problems afterwards. So we've seen that sometimes with OTC labeling with prescription labels as well. So that's things that the FDA can require afterwards. So we also saw emergency use authorizations. That's another thing that there's a couple paragraphs on in the text too. We saw those, especially with COVID, with the vaccines. That's a unique thing, especially with the public health risks, but it doesn't just have to be because of COVID. It could be because of other health risks as well too. But the FDA can authorize unapproved medical products or medications or something for use in emergency. The DESI program. I mentioned the DESI program just because this is in response to the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, because we already had the amendment that basically approved drugs, but now we require drugs safe and effective, but that wasn't the case. There was 1938 to the Kefauver-Harris Amendment. There's a gap there. So we had to go back and we had to make sure that drugs were both after the Kefauver-Harris. So there was a gap there. So you might hear the term DESI drug. I don't know how many there are, but there's still some out there. So we have prescription DESI drugs and we have non-prescription DESI drugs. So I just want you to be familiar with what that term is, because you might hear it in practice. I know, and again, I haven't worked a lot recently in the past few years. I went back during COVID a little bit, but sometimes we would get like these rejects and it would say DESI drug. So again, I don't know how many are out there, but you might still hear that term. So I just wanted to make sure that you were familiar with what DESI meant. OTC drug review, again, OTC drugs also had to go through that review too, but there's so many of them out there, they put them into categories. Okay, so marketed unapproved drugs. So how are there drugs on the market that have not been approved? You might be thinking, how is this possible? But actually, there's quite a few of them. And there could be a good number of reasons why. And your book talks about them. Maybe some of them were pre 1938. Maybe, some of them were, uh, after the fact, so there's a variety of reasons why, but there are still drugs out there that have not been approved. So that's why I mentioned before with the NDC numbers, drugs can have an NDC number on there, but they may not necessarily be approved. So, so as a practitioner, I want to make sure that you know that, or as a pharmacist, as a practitioner, you understand that there could be medications out there that have not been approved by the FDA as safe and effective, and you're dealing with them. So one of them, for example, that I was involved in as an expert on a lawsuit was Armour Thyroid. That's actually a pre-1938 drug, and there was claims by patient that they took it and they were harmed by it. And actually, it was a substitution issue by pharmacists. But if you work, you might be like, oh, we've dispensed Armour Thyroid. It's been on the market pre-1938, so about 100 years, right? Now, if you go and you look at the FDA, there's actually things on their website saying that they don't encourage the use of it, just because there's Synthroid, and Synthroid has been proven safe and effective. Actually, not that long ago, because that was on the market too for a long time, not proven safe and effective, but finally they went through the approval process, again, not that long ago. But some prescribers, some physicians like to use the Armour Thyroid. But a lot of times there's been like back orders, and there's been like shortages on it, but there's also, quote, generics on it. Well, you can't really have an FDA generic AB approval process on a drug that's not even approved by the FDA. So there's issues with that. So anyways, there was a lawsuit that occurred about a generic dispensing for the brand name Armour Thyroid, but it's not even approved, so it's not even in the Orange Book. So how can we even say if it's a generic substitutable product? So it was kind of a big mess. But yeah, so if you hear about drugs that aren't approved, but it definitely happens and it's out there. But they have NDC numbers. So I will not test you on drugs intended to treat serious and life-threatening diseases, but I want you to be aware of it. Again, some of these are open for testing on the MPJE. I'm just cutting back on things that I'm going to test you on, just because, looking for ways to cut back on things. But I want you to be familiar with these things because they are in our profession, they're in our field. You could be exposed to them. What are the chances of being tested on them? I don't know, because I don't write the test questions, but they are open for testing, okay? At the state level, not in my class. So it is important that you look at it and you understand it. If you skip over it and ignore it, it could pop up on an MPJE someday. That's all I'm saying. So I would take the time and I would look at it and I would just have an understanding of what it is. Yes, you don't have to review it and review it and review it for my test, but you might want to make sure that you are familiar with it. Biologics. So biologics, you'll see here in chapter 2. You also see it in chapter 3. We'll have more about it on many topics. So very little in this chapter about it. They are, and I'll test on it too in mine course, but they're derived from living organisms. They are regulated under 2 laws, the Public Health Service Act and the Food Drug Cosmetic Act. We won't be looking at the Public Health Service Act anymore. Just know that these are regulated under multiple laws. It does require pre-market approval from the FDA, and it's subject to the Food Drug Cosmetic Act, just like drugs are, okay? But they're licensed from a public health service law too. So they're regulated really different ways, I guess, but they are like traditional drugs in terms like they're approved like there as well too, but they also have a license as well. So so they do have like a traditional brand name, and then I guess there's like generics, if you will, but there's going to be a little bit different ways that we look at dispensing generics, and we'll get into that in chapter 3. But the FDA does have a role in that, and that's what we'll get into in chapter 3, which is called the Purple Book. where traditional drugs are an orange book. MedWatch, so this is the reporting system for FDA's for adverse events. It's just not for prescription products. There's other products that can also be reported there too. It is important for post-market, obviously, once things hit the market, because that's when, it's open to the general public, if you will. It is voluntary. I would like you to think that it's an obligation because it's an ethical thing. Now, it's easy to